go. Welcome back. Another episode of the Wobcast 2.0. Yours truly, Mike Wobschall, Wobby, here as usual. My partner, co-host, Gyles, also here. Excited to talk to you guys today about the Minnesota Vikings. Specifically, we're going to get into our last conversation about the Vikings haul in the 2023 NFL draft. Last week, we broke down the first three picks the Vikings had in the draft. Today, we break down the final three picks the Vikings had in the draft. Three players I'm actually excited to talk about because I think a couple of them can contribute right away. And I actually came away from the draft as excited, if not more excited, for these last three picks as I was for the first three. So excited to break that down and talk about it with you guys. Also today, we'll talk about the Za'Darius Smith trade, the pros of it, the cons of it, the what happens, the why, the when, all of that. And then we'll preview what's to come next weekend in future episodes of the Wobcast 2.0. So lots to get to today. Excited to do all of it and excited to do it with my partner, Gyles. How's it going, bud?
Hey, how we doing? Happy Tuesday. We're one step closer to the best day of the week. Monday's almost here. And kind of in similar vein, the rookie mini camp is going on right now. So super excited to see some of the new players that we drafted on the field. Some good vibes coming out of the room in Egan, especially considering the whole haul that we got. We got Jaren Hall, who apparently has had some good show-offs here on the limited few snaps that they've had. So definitely excited to chat through it.
I remember Gyles being behind the ropes as I was for so many years with the Vikings. You know, the draft was it was a 2-day event and a 3-day event. But whatever format it was, when it was over, you had the big rush of the undrafted free agent signing. So the draft would be over, and all the TV shows are doing their draft recaps and the wrap ups and all that. But inside the buildings, scouts and coaches are on two different phones and talking to this guy and talking to that guy. And we're trying to convince this guy to come and try out with us, and this guy to sign an undrafted rookie free agent contract with us. And it's just pandemonium for like an hour right after the draft. And then that would be over and the pandemonium would subside, and a cooler or two might be brought out, or we might go to a restaurant nearby and they'd have a room set up for us, and you just kind of decompress in that moment. And it was always lots of like back slaps and fist pounds and high fives. And it's like, you don't know if any of these guys are good or not, but it's, great draft, good draft, good draft. Like, can you believe that guy was there? Oh my God, we're sweating that one out. I can't believe Diggs was still there in the fourth round. So glad we got him. Like, it's just all this, like, there's so much positive upward energy and momentum in that moment. And then the next day comes and you go to work, or maybe you got the day off, but 2 days come and you come back to the building and you sort of start gearing up for what you just said is happening, Gyles. And that's rookie minicamp. And a lot of times the scouts would stay in town for that rookie mini camp. It might be 3 days later, it might be the next weekend, whatever it might be, but they'll stay in town, or they'll leave, but they'll come back. And because the scouts are broken down into geographical area, the college scouts, so they scout a certain part of the country. And especially if there's 1, 2, or more players from their area who made it as part of the draft class or the undrafted class, they can't wait to be there and watch them in our colors.
Yeah.
And I just remember that moment. No matter how you did last season, how poorly the season went, how great the season went, you're in the same place as every other team in that moment. You're watching a bunch of babies, NFL babies out on the field, and you're just so proud of them and you're so tickled to have them. And optimism just reigns so supreme at this time of year. And I can sense that in what I'm watching from the Vikings at rookie camp, the media reports, what I'm seeing on social media, what I'm seeing fans talking about. Like, it's just like the day after Christmas, and you open up all these presents and you can't wait to touch them and play with them and put them into action. And it's really kind of a fun time of year. There's not because the draft, you build it up so much, and so often in life, Gyles, you build something up and then it happens and there's this just let down. And that does not happen in the NFL because you stay at the facility, you got this rookie camp. So I just sense that a lot. And I'm sure you've been watching, reading the same things that I have and our listeners have been, and maybe you sense that too. But I just sense a lot of positivity from TCO lately.
Yeah, 100%. I was going to compare it to kind of a honeymoon period, so to speak, where
Yeah.
you're all focused on upside of what they can be. The downside has not either been discovered or really been identified or really focused on much. So it's always a fun period where you get to focus on the upside, which is a good philosophy to have in life. I think life will always have its challenges, in my opinion, but focusing on the upside, having a level of optimism and focusing on what could be is always a good posture to have in life. So I always like to aspire that to the NFL and
Yep.
really kind of looking at all what they can do for your team. And I think when you bring that down to actual reality for the Vikings, I think the last 3 picks are really, really intriguing, especially
Yeah.
the Jaren Hall pick. I really think outside of the first round quarterbacks, he was actually one of my favorite, even beyond Hendon Hooker and the other ones available. Really intrigued by him, not only unable what he's able to do on the field, but also from a leadership standpoint, his savviness, so to speak. Really excited to chat through all those different options.
And we'll talk about Hall, Roy, and McBride later on in the Wobcast 2.0 today as we break down those selections and how they can help the Vikings right away and what their career might project to as members of the Minnesota Vikings in the National Football League. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, a couple of things. I was at TCO Performance Center on Sunday, Gyles, not as part of a rookie tryout, not to watch practice, but as part of the Susan G. Komen Walk for the Cure. So a belated happy Mother's Day to any of the moms who might be listening. I did not get a glimpse at anything Vikings related. The facility looked pretty closed and shut down to me, but we trudged through the rain, the muck and the mud, and walked around TCO Performance Center for a while, all in the name of a good cause. So that was fun. But secondly, let's talk about the Za'Darius Smith trade. I definitely found myself in the minority, Gyles, with Vikings Nation on this. I feel it's been I think this trade has been very positively received by our brethren in Vikings Nation. Our brothers and sisters, I think, love it. And the reason I think that is because I got absolutely steamrolled on Twitter, which I enjoy. It doesn't matter. That's not my how I'm going to feel about something. I don't get validation if I'm agreed with or disagreed with on Twitter. I'm just observing. Yeah. It was me against the world, I think, for a little while there when I expressed a little confusion at what the Vikings received in exchange for Za'Darius Smith. So I definitely think it was a move Vikings fans like. I will say, let's talk about this a little bit. I don't necessarily disagree that he should have been traded. I get why he was. I just don't know if I love the return or the timing of it. But clearly a move the Vikings fans loved, and a move that creates a little bit of cap room for the team and creates an opportunity for a particular player on the roster to step up and get a little more playing time. So I'll just leave it at that. Let me know and let us know, Gyles, how you felt about it when you saw it roll through. I kind of scratched my head a little bit, although I do in the long run get why they did it. But curious to know your thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a move that I was maybe not disappointed for. That's maybe the wrong word, but I was really hoping that we could maybe find a way to keep him because when healthy last year, he was one of the best, if not the best, edge rushers in football last year.
Yeah.
He was number 1 in sacks, number 1 in pressures. Like, he was a force to be reckoned with. And when you pair that on the opposite side of Daniil Hunter, when used correctly, you were in a phenomenal position. That's even before you added Marcus Davenport. I think someone from ESPN recently came out last week and said with the addition of Marcus Davenport, the Vikings had the best edge rusher group in football, which we've talked a lot about this before. If you're trying to present a Super Bowl contending defensive roster, you have to be able to be great at something. And we were a lot closer to being great at pressure than we were in the secondary. So definitely, I think you're having to take a step backwards. That's definitely for sure. I mean, Za'Darius Smith was a great player when healthy, dealt with some knee issues on the latter half of the season. But ultimately, I mean, he still graded out at an 83 grade the entire season. Great in pass rush, he had an 85 grade. I mean, it was almost his best season in football, period. So I think it's definitely a teardrop to see him not in purple next year. With that being said, it's happened. Like, it's done. It's signed, sealed, delivered. So at the end of the day, we're moving forward. So when you take a step back and then look at Marcus Davenport, who will ultimately be the replacement for Za'Darius Smith, I think there's a lot to be excited about. I don't think he is necessarily Za'Darius Smith, but he is a heck of a lot younger and still produces at a pretty elite level when on the field and when healthy. In 2021, he ended the year at an 88.8 grade when it came to being an edge rusher. Last year, he was injured a little bit, which I think is maybe something to be concerned about, but he still had a 76 grade in overall defensive PFF grade. So honestly, he's never been below a 70 other than his rookie year, which was like a 0.2% away from being a 70 grade. So this guy has always been at least above average, if not elite, in every year he's suited up. So I'm very excited to see what he could be. More importantly, he has a smaller cap hit than what I think Za'Darius Smith was asking for, which is truly, I think, the element that caused him to be traded. I think, although I don't disagree that we didn't get enough back for him, considering he's one of the best edge rushers in football. I think considering he's on the last year of his rookie deal and he had essentially publicized that he's like, hey, I want out. It didn't necessarily put the Vikings into a great negotiation position. So with all those things being considered, I'm glad that we at least got 2 fifth-rounders out of it, in contrast to just being cut and having gotten nothing. But I think he must have asked for something obscene that we weren't able to compensate for, considering that we have Justin Jefferson and all those other ones coming up.
Okay. So, and you hit on a really good point at the very end there, Guile, that he may have been asking for something that is obscene or completely undoable that we don't know about, right? And the team has not shared that, and the team is wise to do that, to not share that. And there may also have been something in the contract related to a payment or a liability that made them do the move when they did it, as opposed to waiting. Because my 2 sharpest criticisms about this are, why now? Why not wait until a team needs it? A guy goes down in an OTA or goes down in training camp or whatever, and they needed a starting edge rusher, and now you've really got them between a rock and a hard spot, and they're going to give up more than a couple fists for it. So, but I don't know what went into the timing. And then I also don't know truly how unhappy he was, because he certainly is not the first player to proclaim displeasure with where he is and he wants to be gone. That happens. But what happens as much as that player being cut or traded is something happens where there's a concession made here, concession made there, and all of a sudden I'm happy to be here. I mean, Lamar Jackson didn't want to be in Baltimore anymore, right?
Yep.
Okay, well, he's still there. So, because they paid him. And so right. So those are the things I didn't like. And the other thing is, I thought they had one of the best pass rushing groups with the trio they had. And now without Smith, they're one injury away from having to trade 2 fifth-round picks for an edge rusher, which they just traded an edge rusher away for 2 fifth-round picks, right?
Yep.
So,
and more than likely, you're not getting a Za'Darius Smith level player if you do that.
Yeah, you won't. Yeah. And also, like, the one criticism on Za'Darius Smith is, how often is he available? And I'm like, well, how often is Danielle Hunter available? I mean, I think Smith's played in more games than Hunter has the last 5 years, and he's certainly played in more games than Davenport has.
Yep. So, and fits better into a 3-4 defense, if we're being honest.
Yeah, good point. And like, that was my favorite thing about the criticism of the Georgia quarterback Stenson, was that he was too small. That's why he was falling. And I'm like, the number 1 pick in the draft is smaller than him, and he's going to go first overall. And so that's why I'm like, we're going to criticize Za'Darius Smith for being hurt or not playing much, when you're going to be relying on Davenport and Hunter, who have played less. So I don't know. It didn't feel right to me.
The only thing against him is his age. And maybe that's what factored into it. But aside from his age, I would have much rather had Za'Darius Smith than Danielle Hunter. Yeah. If you're going to maintain a 3-4 defense.
Me too. And I think if I'm power ranking Smith, Hunter, and Davenport, I'm putting Smith 1.
100%.
You know, and that's a thing. That's another like sub point of the Twitter conversation, that people just looked at me like I was from Mars. But I'm like, I'm sorry, I would. I mean, this isn't a Mike Zimmer 4-3 defense where Danielle Hunter is basically the prototype for what Mike Zimmer wants.
100%.
Danielle Hunter is not the prototype for what the Vikings defense is asking of his position. He's learning a new position. Za'Darius Smith is 100% what you want. And he's a dog
at it.
He is a dog. And every team he's been on in his career has made the playoffs. So I just think Vikings fans are shortchanging him a little bit. And I'm from Minnesota myself, so I'm levying this criticism a little bit at myself. But here in this state, we are very territorial. We are very provincial. So when you declare that you don't want to be here anymore, we're like, huh, okay, see ya.
We're done
Don't
with
want you. Yep. Never
Yeah.
wanted you anyway. Didn't want you anyway. And I think that's what happened with Za'Darius Smith. He said, I don't want to be here anymore. And then Vikings fans just gave up on him. And in the middle of the next season, I bet you Ravens fans are going to be glad they didn't do that to Lamar Jackson, because Lamar Jackson came back and he's probably going to ball out for him. And when Vikings fans, when you're missing pass rush this year and you're asking the front office to go get a pass rusher, just remember you traded away Za'Darius Smith. So
100%.
Yeah.
And I think we mentioned this earlier in the season. I think there's 3 reasons that we only got 2 5th-round picks back. I think one is timing, because of the distance from the draft and necessities needed on other teams, his age, and the amount of contract left on the table. He only has a year left, right? And I've said this before earlier in the season. I'm a much bigger advocate to extending him, give him 6 years for all I care. I mean, look what they did with what's his name from the Bills after he went from LA. They gave him a long-term contract to spread that over. So then when you're trying to trade him away, you have a lot more that you are trading, right? Even if you're like, hey, I want to get rid of Za'Darius Smith. Okay, that's fine. Well, to add more money to it, make him happy, keep him for maybe even one more year while you're maybe still in a Super Bowl window with your current quarterback, and then trade him off next season. Because now you could actually make an argument that you could get a much higher draft pick. I think in a best case scenario, you could have gotten a first back from him considering his production last year. If he didn't get his knee dinged, I think he was maybe one of the best edge rushers in football, like throughout the entire year. And I think that deserves a first round pitch. Yeah.
I don't know. So I don't want to be overly critical on it, because I recognize there are components of this whole thing that I am not aware of. Details of the contract, the true relationship between Za'Darius and the organization. Those are all things that matter a great deal. And I have no idea about where they sit. So you can really only be so opinionated on things like this when you're in the chair that I and we are in. Knowing what I know, however, that's how I feel about it. I think they're going to miss him. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it works out. And then I hope the 2 5th-round picks that they have turn out to be like Hall of Famers, and 4 years, 5, 6, 7 years from now, someone can go find this video and tweet it to me and tell me I'm an idiot. I hope that's what happens.
I think when it comes to putting together an NFL roster, I think there's so much focus on getting cheaper, at least among fans that I know, like, oh, we need to get cheaper. And although I don't disagree, I think the first priority needs to be getting better. Get better. And if you can get better and cheaper, that's obviously the best case scenario, but you never want to get worse and cheaper, at least in my opinion, at least at the right positions. And that's one of the most important positions in football. And I think we maybe prioritize price a little bit more than production. And I think far too many people are looking at the last quarter of the season when he was hurt saying, he's trash. Look at the first part of the season. He was the reasons that we went with the record that we had. He was far better and more productive than Danielle Hunter. He was the best piece of our defense by far and away.
You bring up a great point about allocation of resources, because this is an edge rusher rushing the passer. It's like we choose as a family, they're in our house. We have 4 kids and they're all in activities, and they're all in school. They're all in activities. So it's like, we need vehicles that you can rely on, that are big. And like, when it's time to get new tires, like we live in Minnesota, so like we get good tires. Okay. So maybe in some other areas, like maybe we buy, we get a lot of we'll buy a lot of clothes at Costco, right? Like we're not going to Ralph Lauren, and we're not going to Gap all the time, so we're given a little there, right? Because we feel it's important to allocate some resources to these other areas that will benefit us more and that will impact us more. So to me, Za'Darius Smith at 12 million, 14 million, 16 million, whatever you needed to make him happy here, I'd do that.
To be honest,
for a starting edge rusher. Yeah.
Yep. 100%. And to be honest, I think I would have much rather had Za'Darius Smith than Harrison Smith. I know that's a hot take because he's a Ring of Honor guy. I love Harrison Smith. He's amazing both on and off the field. But if you had to choose, I would have much rather prioritized that money in an edge rusher capacity than a safety, considering how good our safety room is at the moment. Right.
So I guess that kind of puts the bow on the conversation. You actually made, of all the points made, the best one was it happened. It's done. It's over. It happened. So this is where we are, and let the chips fall where they may. I don't think it was a Three Stooges like move by the Vikings front office. I don't think that. I'm just on the other side of it, I think, is all.
Yep.
And I've been in the league enough and watched enough games, as have you, to know there's a very good chance that at some point in the season, and perhaps for an extended time during the season, as a football fan, you're going to say about your team, "Oh, I wish we had a better pass rush." You're probably going to say that, and you just traded away your best one. So we'll see how it plays out. All right, let's talk about the draft. Final 3 picks. 3 players to go over, and we will do it in chronological order of when they were drafted, which will have us begin with another defensive lineman, still on the Minnesota Vikings roster. He was selected in the 5th round, 141st overall, Jaqulein Roy, nose tackle, LSU. My reaction when this happened, Gyles, was I'm not super familiar with this guy, so I'm gonna go watch. So that's what I did, and I went and watched him. And I can't sit here and tell you I watched a ton of tape on him. I watched some highlight reels and a couple of games, and I actually think he can play legit nose tackle. Like, I think he can line up over a center and play there in 2 gap, which is a primary need in this scheme. You need that guy.
I agree. Yep.
And I don't have a player comp. I'm not going to go over the top and compare him to a nose tackle that everyone knows. We'll see how it goes. But I just think you can put him there and ask him to do those things without putting him out of place. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to watch him attempt to do that. I know we've got some bio info to go over here, Gyles, and some data that we have put together and some PFF grades. But from just a high level point of view and a first blush, I kind of like the pick. I think he is a guy who could project and develop into a pretty important player for the team pretty early. So I don't want to be too high on him, but I kind of like this selection. And really, after I started looking at it, I liked him so much that I was like, "Cal, I wonder if I like these final 3 picks more than the first 3." It was how high I was on Roy that's kind of got me down that path. So I gave this one 2 thumbs up, and I can't wait to see him play.
Yeah, 100%. I could not agree more. I was actually going to make the same comparison. I think he's actually finally the Vikings' true nose tackle on the roster, because I think we have a few other defensive tackles that are great, but don't necessarily fit the true nose tackle format. And I think we've forced other players into that. So I think you might even see a higher production out of other players, including Harrison Smith, when they don't have to play a true nose tackle type capacity. I think you're going to see what did I say? Sorry. Harrison Smith. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Harrison Phillips. My apologies. But I think you're going to see a much higher production out of him, considering if you can put Jaqulein Roy in at the nose tackle. So across our entire defensive line, I'm really excited about his introduction. Ultimately, he's from LSU, was born in Baton Rouge, actually. Went to Louisiana State University Laboratory School. He was a 4-star defensive tackle prospect. He was the 6th best defensive tackle prospect in the nation. This guy was a dude. He went back-to-back championship undefeated seasons in high school. He's most pro comp to Jaren Reed. He ultimately committed to LSU and then decommitted. Then he got offers from Alabama, Texas A&M, and then went back to LSU. Wanted to stay home. So this guy, I've heard a lot of kind of denotes around him that he's a super loyal guy. So I think that'll fit well in the Vikings and, more importantly, the Minnesota atmosphere. When he got to LSU, he ultimately skipped his senior year to enter the draft. But before that, he started his first 2 years of college as a defensive tackle. And then his junior year, he switched to nose tackle. And that's where he really started to show up and show off. So really excited to see that. Ultimately, he ended his junior year at a 71.4 grade. He had a few games that kind of brought him down a little bit in tackling, but other than that, he had a pretty phenomenal year. In 2021, he had an 81.2 grade. This guy, when put in the right position, he can be quite elite at pass rush. For example, in 2021, he had an 89.6 grade in pass rush at LSU. So I'm really excited for this pick. I think he really presents a really dominant force to our defensive tackle room.
Yeah, well stated. And I think the PFF grades broken down by running by run defense and pass rush are interesting, because you alluded to this just now, but the pass rush grades are significantly better than the run defense grades. And he's going to need to be good against the run to to be a productive player at nose tackle in this scheme. But I mean, who doesn't want pass rush from the middle, right? I mean, how often do we hear the analyst in a game talk about, I want to get the quarterback off his spot and get
pass interior push.
Yeah, you can rush anyone from the edge, but they can step up into the pocket and throw the ball. You want pressure from the nose, from the middle, right? So looks like Jaqulein is a guy who might be able to provide that.
If especially in a mobile quarterback environment.
Yeah, right. If he can prove his mettle also as a run stopper. So I don't think he is overwhelming you with his size. I think he's got to do things. I think he's got to, I think of John Randall and I think of Aaron Donald, guys who played inside without great size, but they could be in there because of how quick they were. So I think he's got to have a little bit of that to him where he's quick twitch and
technique.
And technique. And that's more of his advantage as opposed to size, strength, and girth. Like him against Bradbury is actually a matchup of undersized guys in the middle. But what about when he goes up against a big center or a big guard? He's going to be outmatched in terms of a pure strength standpoint. So he's got to have proper technique and leverage in those situations. And then he also got to take advantage of his athleticism and his quickness. So excited to see how he fits in this scheme, see how he's coached here. All right. Next, we'll go to Jaren Hall. Obviously a quarterback. So I think a lot of people viewed the Vikings as a sneaky quarterback team in the first round, but they did not take one in the first, second, third, or fourth round. They took Jaren Hall in the fifth round, 164th overall out of BYU. Now, when we talked about him initially, I kind of was presumptive in saying he's going to be the backup. Well, the Vikings have an okay backup in Nick Mullins, so he might not necessarily be the backup so soon. But I guess the point I was trying to make was if your backup or reserve is going to be a young player as opposed to a long in the tooth veteran, a good trait for that young player to have is mobility, because invariably he is going to be rushed out of his reads too early. So you're going to want him to be athletic and mobile in those instances, or he's going to get through his progression. Nothing's going to be there, or he wasn't confident enough to make a throw. And then he's going to have to get out and be athletic. And Hall has that to him. So I like that trait about him. I don't want it to be a primary or even secondary tool that a quarterback uses. And you and I align on that. And that's always one thing we've wondered about with Lamar Jackson and that style of play. So, I don't want that to be the thing he hangs his hat on, but I think it's a nice thing for a quarterback to have in his repertoire. I also think he's got a live arm. When you watch him I don't think I watched a BYU game, certainly not in person, maybe not even on TV, but when you go back and watch his games back from a tape standpoint, he's got a good arm. The whole thing makes all the throws, got an arm that pops, all that. So I think he's got a lot of raw ability and raw tools. There is no pressure on him to do anything except sit and learn, which I think more times than not is a good thing. So he's not a spring chicken, not a young guy by any stretch, but there's no pressure on him to get in there soon. Needs to develop as a backup or a reserve and be ready if called upon. If he's playing in a game this year, it's probably pretty bad news for the Vikings anyway.
Yeah, 100%. Unless he has some type of phenomenal camp that highlights something that we haven't seen before, I would agree. I think this is a developmental guy to be for sure. I do think his age was one of the biggest reasons that he fell as late as he did. Ultimately, he is 25 years old, so he's actually in a similar position that Hendon Hooker is in, which is ultimately why I think Hendon Hooker fell. People want a young rookie quarterback when you get to your fifth-year option. If you do take him in the first round, you don't want them to be 37 years old, right?
Yeah.
So I think that was a big piece why they fell. This is also some reckless speculation, but I also think kind of the BYU comparison might have also made him drop a little bit, considering what's going on with Zach Wilson. I think maybe there's some BYU buzz going around that like, oh, Zach Wilson didn't turn out, so maybe this is not the best place to go grab a quarterback. But outside of that, I'm really intrigued to see what his upside can be considering where he was drafted from, because when you look at all the different categories, I mean, considering that he came from BYU, he was pretty elite in a lot of categories. He ended the year at an 86.3 grade, which I think is fantastic. I mean, ultimately he did grow up in Utah. He's 25 years old. He was married to someone that played soccer from Utah Valley, actually. But before going to BYU. He was actually in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was a full-time missionary, but ultimately his father went to BYU as a running back. His mother was a gymnast, I think, from BYU, but ultimately he's a Utah guy. Went to Maple Mountain in high school, was a 3-star quarterback, was a 19th ranked player out of Utah, and then ultimately went to BYU. He actually, I believe, was the first Black starting quarterback from BYU, and was a 2-sport athlete for baseball and football, obviously. But really intrigued by what this guy could be. I think it's the best combination of getting a non-first round quarterback, but still have a high upside without upsetting Kirk Cousins. If you take anything higher than that, I think there is some tension in your quarterback room.
Agreed. And we talked about that a lot in the build up to the draft, Gyles, is what's that conversation like? And even if you handle it the right way ahead of time and have a great conversation, you take a guy that your current guy perceived as a threat, that relationship is by definition more strained than it otherwise was. And then you question if performance is any degree of suboptimal, if that is why. So the Vikings avoid that entire scenario, but still get a quarterback. And he's clearly a developmental prospect. The numbers and stats and all that are gaudy at BYU. I mean, it's 31-6 touchdown to pick ratio last year, 20-5 the year before. Never thought about the Zach Wilson comparison one time until you just mentioned it. Interesting. I do, he had a medical red shirt in 2020. He's 25 years old. I think for a lot of teams that may have actually just taken him off the board. So part of why he was available in the 5th round, I'm sure. But Vikings get their hands on a quarterback. You give the quarterback coach and offensive coordinator and the head coach a little clay to mold. That's really what it is. See what you can do with it. Kind of am of the opinion that you take a quarterback every year, no matter what, because Tom Brady 199, Drew Brees 2nd round. Like there's just Russell Wilson 3rd round. There's just so many examples in every round of an elite quarterback that you can find. Why not do it every year? The position is so important that it's worth it. So
100%.
All right. Last player that we will dive deeply into today is a running back. It's DeWayne McBride, who the Vikings found in the 7th round, 222nd overall. And I have to admit, I had to look into this and figure out what the heck happened, why this guy was available when he was. I come to understand it's likely a medical reason that he was still available in the 6th round, or perhaps character or some combination of both. So I don't know. I didn't do the scouting on him. I can only read between the lines. It is certainly not from an athleticism or a production standpoint that he fell to where he fell. So you're going to go through some of the background here, Gyles, but some things that you're going to say about McBride's background indicate to me like he's got some athleticism and talent and would make me excited to watch him practice and play. Like he'd be a guy where if I was still at TCO with the team, it'd be like, I'm super excited on Tuesday with the first rookie or whenever it was, super excited to watch McBride. That kid could play. I wonder what he's going to look like in our colors. So a guy I'll be excited to watch. Something tells me he'll have a lot of carries in the preseason. That's my guess.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that in terms of the kind of maybe medical and or character issues, or at least the potential of medical issues, right? It could be an outstanding thing that could have the possibility of being bad, because even Mel Kiper Jr. ranked this guy as the 5th best running back in the draft. That, and this is Mel Kiper. I mean, this isn't a nobody ranking him. I mean, his entire family's centered around football. His brothers are playing D1 football. His uncle played D1 football. Went to Vanguard in high school as a 3-star recruit. Ultimately went to the University of Alabama, Birmingham for college, and did some pretty phenomenal things. I think he had the longest touchdown in school history there. So this guy was pretty phenomenal. When you look at his PFF grades at UAB, last year he had a 94.1 grade. Like this guy was doing great. His run was pretty phenomenal. So ultimately, I think the medical issue, whatever that may be, or whatever thing outside of what the PFF grades are showing, shows that there's a possibility that something could go wrong. But if you really trust the leadership inside TCO, hopefully they can present a good medical position for him to be healthy, as well as put him into a good position from a character standpoint, if that is an issue, to pull the best out of him. Because if you can get truly the best out of him and have him be available, I really expect him to be quite a phenomenal player for the Vikings, honestly. When you think about Dalvin Cook maybe moving on from the Vikings this offseason, whether it's this offseason or next offseason, wherever happens for Dalvin Cook, I think this guy could be a potential successor.
Yeah, I see a potential hole in his game may be catching the ball out of the backfield. I don't know if he's got that ability or not.
Yeah,
It
that's
doesn't
fair.
appear so based on his numbers and background. Only 5 catches in the last 2 seasons, according to what I'm looking at. So if that's true, that's obviously a thing that you'd look for to see if you can get better at that. I'm always careful to levy too heavy of a criticism based on what you can see on paper. Marcus
Mhm.
Sherrills is the best punt returner in Vikings history, and I don't believe he returned a punt in college. So
Mhm.
just because you didn't do it in college doesn't mean you can't do it in the pros or you won't be asked to. So
Yep.
that's part of his game that may have to be developed.
Yep, 100%. And I think you're absolutely correct. I think his passing game was not necessarily something that was something to write home about. But in terms of rushing yards, he actually led the NCAA in total rushing yards with 1,713 or something. I think he
Jeez.
led the nation in yards per game at 155. He was the CUSA Offensive Player of the Year in 2022. Didn't ultimately play in a bowl game, but like this guy had some pretty phenomenal stats across the board when it comes to actually rushing the football.
Yep. Probably a guy where you just want to get the ball in his hands and let him make some plays. And Kevin O'Connell knows how to do that with offensive weapons and
Mhm.
perhaps a weapon in the return game as well. He's certainly going to have to demonstrate something on special teams in
Mhm.
order to make the roster and be a contributor this year. I don't think the cupboard is bare at running back for the Vikings. I think they have some talent in the room, even if Cook leaves.
Mhm.
So not a foregone conclusion that McBride would make the team and be a contributor. He's going to have to prove his mettle.
Mhm.
And I think he'll be given a lot of opportunities to do that in the preseason. I don't expect, especially if Cook is traded or cut, I don't expect Alexander Madison to get much run in the preseason. So other guys like McBride will be called upon in the preseason, and that's where he can really wow some people and end up making the team. So we'll be
Mhm.
interested to see if that happens. All right, so that kind of concludes our breakdown of the Vikings draft class. I think considering it was not a full complement of picks for the Vikings, I think
Mhm.
all things considered, they came away from the draft with a fairly decent haul. They resisted the temptation to jump into next year's collection of picks to supplement or improve their position this year. And they kind of just took their medicine and did it and still came away with some good players. I think they got a guy in Addison who can contribute right away. And then they got some interesting prospects on both offense and defense behind that. And
Mhm.
so for a roster that's pretty good, that's about all you can ask for from a draft class. So we'll put a bow on the draft, and now we'll see how these guys do in practices, OTAs, and the mandatory mini camp in June. Before we wrap it up here, guys, let's preview what's ahead on the Wobcast 2.0 in the coming weeks and shows. We sort of we took a position by position look at the Vikings coming out of the season and projected what we thought they needed to do to be a Super Bowl contender and to be a good team. Then we went over what they could do and what they ended up doing in free agency. And then, of course, we previewed the draft and then reacted to the draft and have analyzed the draft. So those are the main mechanisms by which a team builds its roster in the offseason. We've kind of reached the conclusion of all that. So what's to come is now the team kind of huddles up at TCO Performance Center and they start going on what they're going to look like in 2023 with OTAs, meetings, practices, culture building. They'll take a break in the middle of June and early July, and then they'll come back to training camp, and it's pedal to the metal from there. So what we're going to do is take a look at the Vikings relative to the rest of the division, and we're going to look at it in position by position manner. We'll start with quarterbacks and pass rushers next week, and we'll have some quantitative and qualitative analysis on it. We'll do both. And we'll stack it. We'll say, hey, quarterback room, here's who's 1, here's who's 2, here's who's 3, here's who's 4. We'll go through every position, and after several weeks, we'll be done. And then we'll take a look at the big picture and say, this is where the Vikings sit relative to the rest of the division. Now, easy to predict that it's going to be the Vikings and the Lions more times than not in these position groups, but we'll see where all the chips fall and look at it that way. So it'll be a fun exercise for us to do over the next couple of months as we sort of glance around the division and see where the Vikings stand relative to their division rivals. Should be a lot of fun, Gyles.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited. I think ultimately you have to win the division in order to move on to a special little game in the late February. But I think it's exciting to walk through and see how we stack up to the NFC North.
Yeah. So that's what's to come here on the Wobcast 2.0. We'll have lots of other things that we want to get to as well as we take a look at the league as a whole, some rules changes that'll happen after owners meetings later in the month. We'll take a close look at the Vikings coaching staff. I think next week we'll drill down into top 3 strengths and top 3 weaknesses that we see on the Vikings roster as they look to improve their standing. They were an NFC contender last year, but I think the expectation remains that this will be one of the last teams standing in the conference when all is said and done. So to do that, you need to have strengths that you can hang your hat on, and you need those strengths to compensate for some weaknesses that you might have. So Gyles and I will identify what we think those strengths and weaknesses are next week on the Wobcast 2.0, in addition to looking at quarterbacks and edge rushers in the NFC North. To catch past episodes, future episodes, or to rewatch or re-listen to this one, you do that wherever you find all of your favorite podcasts. So we encourage you to like, subscribe, and follow us on YouTube, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you find your favorite podcast is where you can find us. On behalf of Gyles, this is Wobby signing off for now. Until next time, Skol Vikings.